sort of don't make it in that Hollywood mold. Marguerite Oved ends up setting up a very prominent dance company of Yemenite dance, and Shoshana Damari becomes a famous singer in Israel. By contrast, the men in the same period don't have the same international reputation, with the exception of Topol, who many of you will know from Fiddler on the Roof and his roles in James Bond films. But the other men really end up studying in cinema in the late 1950s and early 1960s and having prominent careers all the way through. You can still find Yoram Gaon starring in films at the moment. And these men have really leading, really prominent roles in the identity and in the creation of Israeli identity. And they become the archetypal Sabra hero figure. So we see them essentially representing acts of nation building, the kibbutz, militarism, and inhabiting those roles in really prominent ways pretty much until most of their deaths. Because Elsie Diane has died recently, Arik Einstein has died recently, and so this is sort of bringing an era to an end. So what was it about Hill 24 that taught us not only about what roles women could play, but how we as the audience would understand our relationship to these women? So we have this fabulous moment where Haya Harari is discovered protecting the body of the commander who is bringing in this illegal, this ship of illegal immigrants. And on the left is Edward Mulhare, who is a British actor. You may remember him from things like Knight Rider. And what we have is him playing the role of the British police officer who discovers her. And he has the torch, he shines it in her face. So we only see her when he sees her. And as he moves the torch away from her face to look at the men, she disappears from the screen. So we are taught as an audience to understand that the women are really symbolic figures, and the men tell us where we're supposed to be looking and what we're supposed to be looking at. That may be a more explicit version of the men telling us what we're supposed to be looking at in our understanding of women. This is a 1964 film, Hole in the Moon, which was a satiric comedy that was trying to work with French New Wave film, was a total bomb with audiences, but a cult classic, particularly among film buffs and academics. So this idea of women half-dressed, women on the screen, and of course he's fully dressed, and the fisherman behind in the background, if you can see, there's an officer here, there's a fisherman over there, and there's an officer back here, they're also fully dressed. So this idea of how we understand clothed and naked also played a strong role in the history of Israeli cinema. So if you've ever seen an Israeli film made anywhere between 1970 and 1995, and there weren't boobs, that was because there were only men in the film. So, with the exception of Gila Almaguer, who ends up playing a very important role in the Israeli cinema industry. She takes on pretty much every role there is, and she's one of the few women who doesn't leave in the 50s and go off and have one of these international careers and then essentially disappear by the early 70s. So she actually makes films for 6 decades. She remains an important actress. She also has a very prestigious theater career. But again, the many roles that she has taken usually include her being a sidekick or an auxiliary figure for men in the film. So this is from Siege, which was a film about a war widow. The husband has died, and the question is about what role she will play as a war widow and what her relation is allowed to be with other men. In this case, Yoram Gaon. In Life According to Agfa, she plays a sort of dying diva, and her role is really represented in relation to the men who admire her or don't. In The House on Shalush, it's about her relationship with a male student. In Salah Shabati, we see her in relation to, that's actually Chaim Topol, who was the same age as her, but you wouldn't know in that scene. Who is playing the senior Yemenite immigrant who, well, I mean, North African immigrant, it's a little like loosey-goosey about where he's actually from. And she is the therapist from the kibbutz who has come to help assimilate these new olim and to help them understand the way, and falls in love with the son who looks comically like the father. And so what changes? What changes women's representation in the way to in relation to their engagement with men? Well, when women begin writing their own stories. And what we have on the left is this of Hakait Shel Avia, Avia's Summer, which is a story that Gila Almagor herself wrote, and was the story of her own biography and her relationship with her mother, who was a Holocaust survivor. Her father was killed before she was born, and so she grew up in a home with this traumatized, deeply traumatized mother, and it's the beginning of the story that she tells about her own life. And this is really one of the very first biographical films that are written by women. And so Gila Almagor, in the process of her career, really begins to change the actual industry itself by starting to articulate her voice. While she's played many of these roles, she also tends to play women of Mizrahi identity. So although I told you that in 1955 we could still find Mizrahi women, Mizrahi, everyone okay with this? Women from North Africa and Arab, originally Arab countries. By the 60s, there were very few Mizrahi women actually being represented on screen. It was mostly Ashkenazi women acting as Mizrahi women, and Gila Almagor would do that as well in a number of films. So, what we see in the film industry is the 1950s and 1960s are really the age of heroic cinema. We have two kinds of cinema. We have a kind of heroic, masculine, men going to war, men being soldiers, and we have comedies. And the comedies are usually coming out of the entertainment troops in the army, the local theatrical troops. And so a lot of those comedies filter into the 60s, and Ephraim Kishon will make a lot of those into films. But by the 1970s, we're starting to see, 1960s and 1970s, we're starting to see a new kind of film as well, ethnic comedies about Mizrahim and Ashkenazim and the encounter between them. Often these are filled with racist stereotypes. The women tend to be either these bustling, maternal, or slightly invisible figures constantly feeding people, or they tend to be objects of sexual lust. That's going to be a major theme of Israeli cinema. And women tend to have more of a starring role in the ethnic melodramas. And so this is really where we start to see women actually getting featured in the film, but the point of featuring them is so that we can see how tragic their lives are and how badly in need of being rescued they are. And usually they're going to be rescued by Ashkenazi men. And it isn't really until the 1990s where women start to be able to rescue themselves. And we see that a little with Tipat Mazal. So the roles that women have, really until the mid-1990s, whether they're comedies or romances or dramas, really situate women in relation to men as objects of lust, as these comic figures, the bustling maternal mother who turns up at the army to make sure her son is being fed. We see, for example, Dahlia and the Sailors. This only works some of the time. Right. Dahlia and the Sailors, Dahlia's in a bikini, and all the men are fully dressed as sailors. So we have a lot of this kind of symbolic representation of women.